I don't go camping to prove anything. I go because it's one of the few places left where your phone doesn't buzz every 5 minutes. Nobody expects you to answer emails, and the loudest thing you'll usually hear is the wind moving through the trees. That's exactly why my friends Nate and Eric agreed when I suggested a forgotten campsite I'd found while looking through old forestry maps online. It wasn't marked on any camping app. No reservations. No picnic tables. No bathrooms. Just an old clearing beside a small lake that could only be reached by leaving the highway, driving miles down an abandoned Forest Service road, and then following another rough dirt trail that most people probably mistook for a logging path. Perfect. We're either gonna find paradise, Nate said as we bounced over another pothole, or a serial killer. Eric laughed from the passenger seat. I'll take serial killer over another campground full of generators and Bluetooth speakers. That pretty much summed up why we were there. We wanted quiet, fishing, some photography, a campfire, nothing else. The paved road disappeared behind us nearly an hour earlier. Cell service had already vanished, and we'd passed exactly one other vehicle since turning into the national forest. The farther we drove, the more forgotten everything looked. Old guardrails leaned toward the trees. Road signs had faded until you could barely read them. Branches hung over the road like nobody had trimmed them in years. Then we reached an old steel bridge. Not one of those big highway bridges. Just a narrow bridge crossing a rocky creek below. And someone was standing on it. At first, I assumed they'd broken down somewhere nearby. But as we got closer, something immediately felt wrong. There wasn't a vehicle. No bicycle. No backpack sitting on the ground. Nothing. Just one man standing near the middle of the bridge. He wore a faded tan hat with a bent brim. A dark green jacket that looked ripped near one shoulder. Old jeans. Heavy work boots. He wasn't holding a thumb out. He wasn't waving. He wasn't even looking around for traffic. He was simply watching the road. Watching us. Is he hitchhiking? Eric asked quietly. I guess. Who waits here? Nate muttered. The bridge wasn't near anything. No houses. No campground. No trailer. No gas station. Nothing. Even if someone stopped for him, where exactly had he come from? As we rolled closer, he slowly turned his head to follow us. His expression never changed. No smile. No frustration. No relief. Just watching. For a second, I eased off the gas. Maybe he needed help. Maybe his truck had broken down farther down the road. But every instinct I had told me not to stop. The location made no sense. And something about the way he stood there, perfectly still, almost like he'd been waiting specifically for our truck, made every hair on my arm stand up. I wouldn't, Nate said. I wasn't going to. I pressed the accelerator again. We drove past him. As we crossed the bridge, I checked my mirror. He hadn't moved. He just kept turning his head until he was staring directly through the back window. Nobody spoke for almost 30 seconds. Finally, Eric broke the silence. I bet he'll still be standing there tomorrow. Nate laughed. Probably. None of us knew how unsettling that joke would become. The dirt road after the bridge got much worse. Twice I thought we'd taken a wrong turn because the trail narrowed so much that branches scraped both sides of the truck. Eventually, the GPS froze completely. According to my downloaded map, we still had another 6 miles before reaching the lake. Imagine trying to walk all this, Eric said. No thanks. It took nearly 30 more minutes before the trees finally opened. The lake appeared almost without warning. Crystal clear water reflected the afternoon sky like polished glass. Tall pines surrounded the shoreline on every side. No boats. No cabins. No docks. Nothing. Just one open clearing large enough for a couple of tents. This, Nate said as he climbed out, is worth every pothole. I couldn't disagree. It was exactly what we'd been hoping for. We spent the next couple of hours setting up camp, collecting firewood, and taking pictures around the lake. Eric flew his small camera drone for a few minutes while there was still enough sunlight. Nate caught 2 decent-sized trout before dinner. I remember thinking I hadn't felt that relaxed in months. There was a strange comfort in knowing nobody else seemed to know this place existed. As evening settled in, we cooked the fish over the fire. The smell mixed with pine and wood smoke. The lake stayed perfectly calm. Not even a ripple. We joked about work. About an old camping trip where Eric forgot sleeping bags. About how we'd probably come back before the end of summer. Everything felt normal. Safe. If you're enjoying the story so far, don't forget to subscribe. It really helps the channel. And if you've ever had a camping trip that turned strange, let me know in the comments after the story. I genuinely like to read it. By the time darkness settled over the lake, the temperature had dropped enough that we all moved closer to the fire. The flames became the only real light left. Everything beyond them disappeared into blackness. At first, the forest sounded normal. Wind, crickets, leaves shifting. Then, without any of us mentioning it, the woods became quiet. Not gradually, almost all at once. I remember looking toward the trees because I realized I couldn't hear the insects anymore. You noticed that? Eric asked. The bugs? Yeah. Nate shrugged. They'll come back. Maybe. Probably. It wasn't unusual enough to worry about. A few minutes later, I grabbed my flashlight to find another piece of firewood we'd stacked near the edge of camp. The beam swept across the trees. For just a split second, I thought I saw movement. Someone stepping behind a pine. I stopped, held the light steady. Nothing. Probably a deer. Maybe a raccoon. There were plenty of animals out there. I grabbed the log and walked back. What? You looked like you saw something. Probably just wildlife. Nate grinned. The hitchhiker finally found us. Eric chuckled. Yeah, right? We all laughed. Because the idea was ridiculous. We'd driven nearly 20 miles since passing that bridge. Then we'd spent another half hour bouncing down roads that barely deserved to be called roads. Even if someone somehow followed us, we would have noticed, right? I wish we'd packed up the second that joke stopped being funny. Instead, we stayed exactly where we were. And about 20 minutes later, I looked toward the trees again. This time, someone was standing there. He wasn't close enough for the firelight to fully reach him. Just far enough that everything about him looked washed in shadow. At first, my brain did what it always does in situations like that. Tried to explain it away. A tree stump, a broken branch. One of those tricks your eyes play when you're staring into darkness too long. I blinked. The shape was still there. Tall, perfectly upright, not moving. I frowned and leaned forward a little. Nate! He looked up from the fire. What? Tell me if I'm imagining this. He followed my gaze toward the trees. There was a pause. Then his expression changed. Who's that? Eric immediately turned around. What are you guys looking? He stopped mid-sentence. For several seconds, nobody spoke. The figure remained completely still. It wasn't hiding. It wasn't approaching. It was simply standing there at the very edge of the firelight, where the darkness swallowed every detail except its outline. Eric laughed nervously. Maybe another camper? From where? Nate asked without taking his eyes off the figure. There aren't supposed to be any. I slowly stood. Hey! My voice echoed across the trees. Nothing. No answer. No wave. No movement. Just silence. I tried again. You okay? Still nothing. The figure didn't react. It honestly would have been less unsettling if they'd yelled back or even walked away. Instead, they just stood there, watching us. Nate grabbed one of the larger flashlights from the picnic gear. I'm gonna light him up. He clicked it on. The powerful beam cut across the clearing and landed exactly where the figure had been. Empty. There was no one there. Huh. Nate moved the flashlight left, then right. Nothing. He moved, Eric whispered. Where? I don't know. The beam searched every tree within 50 yards. Nothing.
No footsteps. No snapping branches.
No sound at all. Maybe he ducked behind something, I said, though I didn't really believe it. There isn't anything to hide behind, Nate replied. He wasn't wrong. The nearest trees were thick, but there hadn't been enough time. Whoever we'd seen should have still been visible. Instead, they were simply gone. We all stood there for another minute before finally sitting back down. Nobody said much after that. The easy conversation from earlier had disappeared. Even the fire sounded louder now. Crack, pop, hiss. Every little noise made someone glance toward the woods. Eric eventually tried to lighten the mood. Okay. He forced a smile. Let's assume it was another camper. Camping where? Nate asked. Eric shrugged. Somewhere. There aren't any clearings nearby. I know. Then how'd they get here? I don't know. Nobody liked the conversation. It always ended the same way. Nothing made sense. About 10 minutes later, Eric picked up his camera. I forgot I recorded while we were cooking. He scrolled through a few clips. Mostly the fire, Nate cleaning fish, me trying and failing to keep smoke out of my face. We laughed a little. Felt good. Normal. Then Eric stopped smiling. Guys. His voice was barely above a whisper. What? Come here. Nate and I moved beside him. Eric replayed the last 30 seconds of one clip. The camera had been sitting on a small tripod pointed toward the fire. Most of the frame showed us talking. Behind us, beyond the edge of the flames, something stood between two pine trees. The camera hadn't focused on it. It almost blended into the darkness. But once you saw it, you couldn't unsee it. Eric paused the video. My stomach tightened. The hat, the bent brim, the torn shoulder on the jacket. I felt cold all over.
No.
Nate whispered. No way. I stared at the frozen frame. I know him. Neither of them answered. I mean, I've seen him. Eric slowly looked at me. The bridge. Nobody spoke. We didn't need to. Every one of us remembered. The same hat, the same jacket, the same posture, standing perfectly still. Watching. Nate looked back at the woods. That's him. It can't be. It is. We left him miles back. I know. There wasn't another road. I know. He couldn't have walked here. I know. My own voice surprised me, because I didn't actually know. I was trying to convince myself as much as them. The only thing I knew for certain was that the man in Eric's recording looked exactly like the hitchhiker we'd passed hours earlier. Not similar. Not close. The same person. Eric zoomed in on the paused frame. The image became grainy, but the details stayed. That old hat. The ripped shoulder. His arms hanging straight at his sides. Looking directly toward us. I didn't even notice him while I was filming, Eric said quietly. None of us had, which somehow made it worse. He'd been standing there, watching us, without any of us realizing. Nate immediately stood. That's it. What? We're leaving. I looked around camp. Our tents. Forget them. The truck's packed behind all the gear. We'll throw everything in. It's pitch black. I don't care. His voice had changed. He wasn't panicking. He was thinking, calculating. The road out is bad enough during daylight, he continued. If we rush, we could drive into a ditch. So what? So we leave smart. Eric nodded. We pack essentials. Keys. Phones. Lights. Leave everything else. That sounded reasonable. Nobody wanted to stay, but nobody wanted to sprint blindly into the woods either. We moved quickly. Sleeping bags, wallets, truck keys, first aid kit, flashlights. Within a couple of minutes, we'd gathered almost everything we'd actually need. I was zipping my backpack when something made me look up. The trees. He was back. Closer this time. Not by much. Maybe 15 yards closer than before. Still completely motionless. Still silent. I froze. Nate! He turned. The color drained from his face. The hitchhiker hadn't spoken. Hadn't waved. Hadn't threatened us. He'd simply changed positions. Slowly. Patiently. Like he'd been measuring the distance between us one step at a time. Nate raised the flashlight again. The beam snapped toward the figure. The instant it reached him, he slipped behind the nearest tree. Not running. Not stumbling. Just one smooth step sideways. The trunk hit him completely. Nate rushed forward a few feet, keeping the light fixed on the tree. Come out. Nothing. We waited. Silence. He edged closer. The flashlight never left the trunk. Don't, I said. What if he's armed? Nate stopped. He knew I was right. The last thing we wanted was to walk into the darkness toward someone who had already proven they could get frighteningly close without making a sound. Then Eric whispered the words that made every decision afterward feel impossible. Guys! We both looked back. He wasn't staring at the trees anymore. He was staring toward the truck. Oh! My God! The path to our truck was no longer clear. The truck sat about 40 yards from the fire, parked where the old clearing narrowed into the overgrown trail we'd driven in on. From where we stood, we couldn't see the driver's side anymore. At first I thought it was because of the angle. Then I realized why Eric had gone pale. Someone was standing near it, not leaning against it, not trying to get in, just standing between us and the only road out. For a second, my brain refused to accept what I was seeing. I looked back toward the tree where the hitchhiker had disappeared. Nothing. Then I looked at the truck again. The same outline, the same hat, the same rigid posture. I felt my stomach drop. How? Nate whispered. None of us had seen him cross the clearing. We hadn't heard footsteps. There was enough open ground between the trees and the truck that someone should have been visible the entire time. Instead, he was simply there. Eric swallowed hard. He wants us to go that way. The words hung in the air, because they made a disturbing kind of sense. He wasn't wandering around. He wasn't asking for help. He was controlling where we could and couldn't move. Every instinct I had screamed that walking straight toward him would be the worst decision we could make. We stay together, I said quietly. No one goes off alone. Both of them nodded immediately. For the next minute, nobody moved. We watched him. He watched us. The fire crackled between us, throwing shifting shadows across the clearing. Then, without warning, the man tilted his head. Just slightly. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't exaggerated. But seeing that tiny movement after he'd stood perfectly still for so long made my skin crawl. Nate tightened his grip on the flashlight. He's messing with us. I know. He knows we're scared. I know. Eric quietly reached into one of the storage bins we'd left open. What are you looking for? I whispered. The air horn. What? I keep one in my emergency kit. For bears. He pulled out a bright orange marine air horn. I don't care if it's a person or an animal. That thing's loud. Exactly. He looked at us. If he's trying not to be noticed, this changes things. It was the first idea anyone had suggested that didn't involve walking directly toward the stranger. Eric took a slow breath. You guys ready? Neither of us answered. He pressed the trigger. The blast shattered the silence. It was deafening. The sound echoed across the lake, bounced off the hills, and rolled through the forest for several long seconds. Birds exploded from the treetops. Somewhere deeper in the woods, branches shook as animals bolted away. The man didn't flinch. He didn't cover his ears, didn't step back, didn't even blink as far as I could tell. He simply kept looking at us. "Okay," Eric muttered. "That's not normal." Nate shook his head.
No.
"It's not." Then something changed. The hitchhiker took one step, just one, toward us. Crunch. The sound of a boot on gravel carried through the clearing. It was the first noise we'd heard him make all night. One deliberate step. Then he stopped again. Nobody breathed. Another long silence. Then, crunch. One more step. Not rushing, not charging. Closing the distance one measured stride at a time. "He wants us to panic," I whispered. Nate nodded without looking away. "If we scatter, we're done." We backed toward the fire together. None of us turned our backs on him. The flames were dying now. Without adding more wood, the campsite was getting darker by the minute. I grabbed another log and threw it onto the fire. It flared brightly. For a moment, the extra light illuminated the man's face. Only for an instant, he looked older than I'd first thought. Late 50s, maybe early 60s. Thin, weathered. His beard was patchy with gray. There was dirt smeared across one side of his face. His expression was completely blank. Not angry, not smiling, just empty, as if he'd already decided exactly how the night was going to end. The fire settled again, and his face disappeared back into shadow. Nate leaned close enough that only Eric and I could hear him. "I've got an idea." "What?" "He keeps moving when we aren't looking directly at him." I frowned. "So, what if we make him think we're staying?" Eric understood before I did. "The tents." Nate nodded. "We kill the lanterns. Zip ourselves inside. Wait. If he comes closer, we make a run for the truck while he's focused on camp." It wasn't a perfect plan. Actually, it was terrible. But every other option seemed worse. Walking straight toward him definitely wasn't happening. Waiting until daylight meant spending another 6 or 7 hours with a stranger circling our campsite. None of us wanted that. We quickly whispered through the details. Truck keys stayed with me. Eric would carry the brightest flashlight. Nate would grab the bear spray from his backpack. None of us expected to fight. The spray wasn't about winning. It was about creating enough confusion to get inside the truck. We doused the lantern. The clearing became dramatically darker. Only the campfire remained. One by one, we climbed into separate tents. I left my zipper open just enough to watch outside. My heartbeat was so loud I was sure he could hear it. For several minutes, nothing happened. The fire popped softly outside. Wind brushed against the rainfly. Then, crunch. Another footstep. Closer. I held my breath. Crunch. Another. He was entering the campsite. Slowly. Patiently. I could only see pieces of him between the folds of my tent. A boot. The edge of his jacket. A shadow crossing the firelight. He wasn't searching. He wasn't calling out. He was simply walking through our camp as though he already owned it. He stopped near the fire, less than 20 feet away. I could hear him breathing. Slow, steady. Then another sound. The soft scrape of metal. I couldn't see what he was doing, but it sounded like he was touching something on our cooking table. Maybe one of the pots. Maybe the cooler latch. Maybe testing whether we were really asleep. Every second stretched forever. Then, through the narrow opening in my tent, I saw him turn his head toward Nate's tent and take one slow step in that direction. Nate looked at me through the tiny gap in his own zipper. Our eyes met. No words, just the slightest nod. It was time. We either ran now, or we weren't getting another chance. The nod lasted less than a second. That was all it took. Nate burst out of his tent first. At the exact same moment, Eric shoved his tent flap open and switched on the high-powered flashlight. The beam hit the hitchhiker square in the chest. For the first time all night, he reacted. Not by running, not by speaking. He lifted an arm to shield his eyes. "Now!" Nate shouted. I grabbed my backpack and sprinted. The three of us ran together, staying shoulder to shoulder just like we'd planned. The truck was only 40 yards away, but it felt impossibly far. Behind us, I heard quick footsteps for the first time that night. He was moving faster, a lot faster. "Don't look back," Eric yelled. I looked anyway. The hitchhiker had abandoned the slow, deliberate pace he'd kept for hours. He was jogging after us, cutting across the clearing instead of following the path. He'd been capable of moving quickly the entire time. He'd simply chosen not to. That realization scared me more than anything else. He hadn't been stalking us because he couldn't catch us. He'd been doing it because he wanted us terrified before we ever tried to leave. We reached the truck almost together. I hit the unlock button before I was even close enough to grab the handle. The headlights flashed. The locks clicked. "Get in!" Eric jumped into the passenger seat. Nate climbed into the back. I yanked the driver's door open, and it slammed shut again. The hitchhiker had grabbed the edge of it. He didn't say a word. He just held the door with one hand, staring at me from the other side. Up close, he looked exhausted. Deep lines covered his face. His beard was dirty. His clothes smelled damp, like they'd been soaked and left to dry over and over. His eyes never left mine. For one frozen second, neither of us moved. Then Nate leaned out the rear window. "Move!" A blast of bear spray shot across the space between us. The orange cloud caught the hitchhiker across the face. He finally made a sound. A raw, choking gasp. His grip loosened. I ripped the door open, threw myself inside, and slammed it shut. "Go! Go!" Eric yelled. My hands shook so badly I nearly dropped the keys. The engine didn't start. My heart stopped. I looked down. Neutral. In my panic, I'd bumped the shifter. I jammed it into park and turned the key again. The engine roared to life. The hitchhiker staggered toward the front of the truck, wiping at his eyes. He wasn't blind, just slowed down. He reached the driver's side headlight and stopped. For a terrifying second, I thought he was going to stand there and force me to hit him. Instead, he stepped just enough into the narrow trail that there wasn't room to squeeze past without risking a collision with the trees. "He wants us to stop," Nate said. "I know. What are you doing?" I took one deep breath. Then I flicked on the roof-mounted off-road lights. 6 bright LEDs exploded to life. The narrow trail turned white. The hitchhiker threw both hands over his face. He stumbled sideways, blinded by the sudden light. It wasn't much, maybe 2 feet, but it was enough. I slammed the truck into drive. We lurched forward, branches scraping both sides as I squeezed through the gap. The passenger side mirror snapped backward against a tree with a loud crack. For one horrible second, I thought we'd clipped him. I looked in the mirror. He was still standing in the middle of the trail. The white lights washed over him as we pulled away. He never chased us. He never waved. He just stood there, shrinking into the darkness until the trees swallowed him completely. None of us spoke for the first 10 minutes. The only sounds inside the truck were heavy breathing and loose camping gear rattling in the back. Every few seconds, one of us checked behind us. Nothing.
No headlights. No flashlight.
No one following on foot. When we finally reached pavement, I didn't slow down. The first place with cell service was almost 45 minutes away. I pulled into a gas station so hard the tires chirped. The clerk took one look at us and asked if we'd been in an accident. I told him to call the police. 2 sheriff's deputies met us before sunrise. We went back with them later that morning. Part of me hoped daylight would make everything seem ridiculous. Didn't. Our campsite looked exactly as we'd left it. Tents still standing, cooler open, cooking gear scattered around the fire. One folding chair had been knocked over during our run. The deputies searched the clearing, the trail, and the surrounding woods for hours. They found no campsite belonging to anyone else. No discarded food.
No backpack. No bicycle.
No vehicle hidden along the roads. No footprints they could confidently identify. The ground was covered in dry pine needles, making tracks almost impossible to preserve. One deputy did point out something that made my stomach tighten. There was a fresh muddy smear across the driver's door handle. Not enough for fingerprints, just enough to suggest someone with wet, dirty hands had grabbed it recently. The deputies couldn't say when it happened, but I knew. One of them eventually asked the question I'd been asking myself since the night before. "Are you sure this wasn't just another camper?" I looked around. There wasn't another campsite within miles. No marked trails. No nearby roads. No reason for anyone to wander into ours in the middle of the night without saying a single word. I simply answered, "I'm sure." The investigation went nowhere. No missing persons matched the description. No reports of suspicious activity.
No abandoned vehicles.
Nothing. Eventually, the file was closed. Life moved on. At least it was supposed to. About 8 months later, curiosity got the better of me. I drove back, not to camp, just to see that bridge again. I parked safely off the road and spent nearly an hour walking the surrounding area. That's when the full weight of it finally hit me. There was nothing there. No side roads.
No cabins. No hunting camps. No hiking trails.
No businesses. No houses. Just miles of forest in every direction. The nearest place anyone could reasonably have started walking from was so far away that reaching the bridge on foot would have taken hours. Yet when we'd passed him that afternoon, he hadn't looked tired. He hadn't looked lost. He hadn't even looked like someone waiting for help. He'd looked like someone waiting for us. I still camp, just not in places where no one knows I'm there. And every time I drive across an empty bridge or pass someone standing alone on a forgotten road, I catch myself checking the rearview mirror a little longer than I used to, because the part that still keeps me awake isn't that we found someone deep in the woods. It's that somehow he got there before we ever realized we were being followed. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe for more true-style camping horror stories every week. And let me know in the comments, what would you have done if you saw the same hitchhiker standing outside your tent miles after passing him on the road? I'd love to read your answers, though I hope none of them come from experience.